By 1930, 300,000 New Yorkers believed the same thing. Their money was safe. Not because they'd read a prospectus. Not because they understood banking law. They believed it because of a name so official-sounding, so reassuring, that regulators and lawmakers would later have to explain, again and again, why it wasn't what it appeared to be. The bank was called the Bank of United States. Not a Bank of the United States. Not a branch of the federal government. Just a private commercial bank in New York City that happened to share 3 words with the most trusted institution imaginable. And for the immigrant families of the Bronx, Brooklyn, and the Lower East Side, tailors, garment workers, small shopkeepers who'd fled poverty in Eastern Europe, that name meant everything. It meant this was where you put the money you couldn't afford to lose. They were wrong, and almost nobody outside a small circle of executives knew it until it was far too late. The man at the center of it was Bernard Marcus, a builder's son turned banker who had grown the institution from a modest immigrant-focused bank into one of the largest in the country, with branches stretching across the boroughs. On paper, it looked like an American success story, a bank built by immigrants, for immigrants, finally proving they belonged in the financial system that had ignored them for decades. But behind the marble counters and the reassuring paperwork, something else was happening. Marcus and his inner circle weren't just running a bank. They were running real estate deals, investment pools, and stock manipulation schemes, often using the bank's own subsidiaries to buy up its own stock, artificially propping up the price so depositors would keep believing the institution was thriving. It's the financial equivalent of a man convincing his neighbors his house is worth a fortune by secretly buying it from himself, over and over, at higher and higher prices. Every sale looked like proof of strength. Every rising number looked like confidence. In reality, it was a mirror reflecting a mirror value that existed only because everyone agreed not to look too closely. And for years, almost nobody did. Because here's the uncomfortable truth about trust. Once people decide an institution is safe, they stop asking questions. That's not stupidity. That's how trust is supposed to work. You don't re-audit your bank every time you make a deposit. You assume someone else, regulators, examiners, the bank's own board, is doing that job for you. In 1930, that assumption was about to be tested in the worst way imaginable. Because the bank wasn't just overextended, it was quietly, catastrophically insolvent. And the people who knew it, the people making the decisions, kept the doors open anyway. They had one more move left. The insolvency didn't happen overnight. It built slowly, the way a crack spreads through a foundation long before the wall finally gives way. Marcus and his partners, including Saul Singer, had spent years using depositor money to prop up their own real estate ventures and stock schemes. When those investments started souring, as the late 1920s real estate boom began to wobble, they didn't stop. They doubled down. Picture a man juggling to keep the crowd entertained, except every ball he's throwing is borrowed, and dropping even one means the whole show ends. That was the bank's real business model by 1930, not lending and saving, but frantically keeping enough cash moving to disguise a hole that kept getting deeper. Internally, some people knew. State banking examiners had flagged troubling irregularities as early as 1929, questionable loans, inflated asset values, transactions between the bank and its own affiliated companies that looked less like banking and more like a shell game. But warnings inside a bureaucracy don't automatically become action. Reports got filed. Meetings got held. And somehow, the bank kept operating, kept opening new branches, kept accepting deposits from families who had no idea examiners were already worried. That's one of the most unsettling parts of this story. It wasn't hidden in some impenetrable code only Wall Street could decipher. It was sitting in government filings. People with the power to stop it had the information. They just didn't stop it in time. Why? Partly bureaucratic slowness. Partly the fear of what would happen if a bank this size, serving hundreds of thousands of small depositors, was suddenly shut down. And partly, some historians argue something uglier: hesitation from a banking establishment that saw the Bank of United States, with its immigrant, largely Jewish clientele, as an outsider institution unworthy of the kind of quiet rescue that Wall Street's inner circle routinely arranged for each other. Because that rescue was actually on the table. In early December 1930, a group of larger banks discussed merging with or absorbing the Bank of United States to prevent a collapse, the kind of behind-closed-doors bailout that happened all the time among the city's financial elite. For a few days, it looked like it might actually happen. Then it fell apart. Accounts differ on exactly why. Some blame personality conflicts. Some blame lingering prejudice against Marcus and his bank. Some blame simple financial reluctance once the other banks saw how deep the hole really was. Whatever the reason, the rescue collapsed just as quietly as it had been arranged, with no public announcement, no warning to the depositors whose entire future depended on a decision they never even knew was being made. Somewhere in a room they never saw, ordinary people's life savings were being weighed, debated, and ultimately abandoned. And 300,000 depositors were about to find out, all at once, in the worst possible way. On December 11, 1930, a rumor started moving through the streets of the Bronx. Nobody remembers exactly who said it first. Someone claimed a branch of the Bank of United States had refused to sell a customer his own stock. Small detail, almost nothing. But rumors don't need facts to spread, they only need fear. And fear was already sitting just under the surface of a city living through the early months of the Great Depression. By that afternoon, lines had formed outside branches across the city. Not orderly lines, panicked ones. Men left factory jobs. Women pulled children out of school. Shopkeepers closed early. Everyone wanted the same thing, their money now before it was too late. This is the part of the story people call a bank run, but that phrase is too clean, too clinical, for what it actually felt like. Imagine thousands of people who trusted an institution with everything they had, suddenly realizing that trust might have been a mistake, and that the only proof of who was right would be whether they got to the counter before the money ran out. It's musical chairs played with people's entire life savings. Everyone assumes the music will keep playing. Then someone notices a chair is missing, and suddenly nobody's walking anymore. Everyone's running. By the end of that first day, panicked depositors had withdrawn roughly $2 million, an extraordinary sum for 1930, pulled from a single institution in a matter of hours. The bank scrambled. Executives tried to project calm, insisting the institution was sound, that this was nothing more than a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Nobody believed them. Why would they? The very people now offering reassurance were the same people who had spent years quietly hollowing the bank out from the inside. On December 11, 1930, state banking officials made the call. The Bank of United States would not open its doors the next morning. 60 branches across New York City, serving roughly 400,000 depositors, simply shut down permanently. There was no dramatic announcement, no press conference preparing the public for what was coming. People arrived the next day to find locked doors, printed notices, and silence. Some stood outside for hours, refusing to believe what was written in front of them. Others simply sat down on the curb because there was nowhere left to go and no one left to ask. It was, at the time, the largest bank failure in American history. Somewhere between $200 and $400 million in deposits, depending on how you count it, vanished behind those closed doors, along with the futures of people who had done everything right. They'd worked, they'd saved, they'd trusted. And trust, it turned out, had been the riskiest investment of all. But the story wasn't over. Someone still had to answer for it. In the weeks after the collapse, the shock turned to something colder: anger. Investigators from the New York County District Attorney's Office began combing through the bank's books, and what they found confirmed the worst suspicions. This wasn't simple mismanagement. It wasn't a bank caught off guard by a bad economy. It was, prosecutors argued, a deliberate pattern of fraud, assets manipulated, loans extended to insiders on terms no outside customer would ever receive, and stock prices propped up through transactions designed to look like organic market confidence when they were really the bank buying its own shares to fool everyone, including its own depositors. Bernard Marcus and Saul Singer were indicted. The trial became a sensation, covered breathlessly by New York newspapers hungry for someone to blame for a catastrophe that had touched nearly every immigrant neighborhood in the city. Depositors packed the courtroom. Some had lost every dollar they owned. Others had lost money set aside for a daughter's wedding, a son's education, a funeral. They wanted to look the men responsible in the eye. In 1931, Marcus and Singer were convicted. Marcus received a sentence of several years in Sing Sing prison. It felt, to many, like justice. But it also felt incomplete, because prison time doesn't return $400 million to 400,000 families. It doesn't undo the eviction notices, the canceled weddings, the children pulled from school because there was no longer money for books or shoes. That's the part true crime headlines about Wall Street villains often skip past. The punishment for the men at the top rarely matches the damage done to the people at the bottom. Marcus served his time and was eventually released. He didn't die in disgrace. He didn't vanish from history in poverty. He simply faded from the spotlight, a free man years before most of his depositors had recovered even a fraction of what they'd lost. Because recovery for the depositors was agonizingly slow. It took years of litigation and asset liquidation for creditors to see partial repayment, and even then, many recovered only a portion of their original deposits. For families already living paycheck to paycheck in the depths of the Depression, partial repayment, eventually, wasn't justice. It was a wound that never fully closed. But the collapse of the Bank of United States didn't just destroy individual lives. It exposed a hole in the entire American financial system. If a bank this size, with this many depositors, could implode overnight with almost no public warning, then the problem wasn't just one dishonest banker. It was a system built entirely on faith, with almost no structural safety net underneath that faith. That failure became one of the pressures that helped push Washington, a few years later, toward a radical idea. What if depositors didn't have to rely purely on trust? What if the government itself guaranteed their money so that a bank's collapse didn't mean a family's collapse? In 1933, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was created. It's easy to hear that sentence and let it pass by as just another regulatory footnote. It isn't. Every single time an American walks into a bank today and doesn't feel the need to interrogate its balance sheet before making a deposit, they're standing on a protection built directly from this disaster, and others like it. The peace of mind is not natural. It was earned, retroactively, by people who lost everything before anyone thought to build the safety net. The Bank of United States didn't fail because the math was too complicated for regulators to understand. It failed because trust was allowed to substitute for oversight, right up until the moment there was nothing left to trust. A name that sounded official, executives who looked respectable, numbers that appeared to climb year after year because the men reporting them had every incentive to make sure they did. Somewhere in the Bronx, in December of 1930, a shopkeeper who had spent 15 years saving for his daughter's future stood outside a locked door, reading a printed notice he couldn't quite believe. He hadn't made a single bad decision. He had simply believed what he was told by a bank by its name, by an entire system that promised it was watching so he wouldn't have to. That's the real lesson buried under the numbers. Financial collapses are rarely just about greed at the top. They're about the invisible agreement the rest of us make every single day. The agreement to trust institutions we can't personally audit, run by people we've never met, because the alternative is a society where no one can save, invest, or plan for tomorrow. Most of the time, that trust holds. But every so often, someone in a position to betray it decides the reward outweighs the risk. And by the time anyone notices, the money and the trust that built it is simply gone.